Tensions are escalating between Washington and Pretoria, and yes, Trump is at the center of it again. On Thursday, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa dismissed Trump's threat to exclude Pretoria from next year's G20.
For years, South Africa has been one of the core members of the G20, the exclusive group of the world's largest economies that shapes global trade, finance, and development. It helped build the forum, hosted its own presidency, and sat as an equal beside giants like the United States, China, and India. Nothing about South Africa's place in the G20 was ever questioned. Until now. In a sudden and unprecedented move, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that South Africa would be excluded from all G20 events during America's 2026 presidency. The decision shocked diplomats worldwide because no country, especially not a founding member, has ever been barred from the G20 since its creation. Washington claimed its reasons were tied to accusations of racism and mistreatment of white Afrikaners, accusations South Africa rejects as false. Pretoria fired back, calling the ban illegal and undemocratic. But before the world can judge the fight, one question must be asked. How did a trusted G20 partner suddenly become the target of an international ban? Let's find out. Until the moment it happened, nobody believed it could happen. The G20 was designed to be a forum of equals, a place where the world's biggest economies could disagree fiercely inside the room, but still respect the rules that kept the system intact. Every country in that circle, from the United States to South Africa, knew the golden principle. Once you are a G20 member, nobody can take your seat away, not even the host. That principle collapsed in one afternoon. The shock began with a simple announcement posted on President Donald Trump's social media platforms. No diplomatic cable, no consultation with other members, no formal letter. He wrote that South Africa was terminated from all 2026 G20 activities under the U.S. presidency. The wording was combative, the tone personal, and the implication unmistakable. Washington believed it had the authority to police other members. Inside Pretoria, there was a moment of stunned silence. South Africa was not just another participant. It was among the countries that helped shape the G20 when the world needed coordination after the global financial crisis. It was part of the foundation. It had chaired meetings, hosted summits, and consistently acted as a bridge between the global North and the global South. Its membership was not conditional, negotiable, or replaceable. And yet, here was the United States behaving as if South Africa's place was an optional privilege.
President Trump was busy on social media today. In this post on X, he said that South Africa would not get an invitation to the G20 summit that will be held next year in Miami, Florida. He also went on to accuse the country of killing white South Africans, even taking the land of white farmers.
Immediately after Trump's announcement, American media outlets reported that the exclusion was tied to alleged violence against white Afrikaners and supposed land confiscation policies. Claims that South Africa's courts, human rights bodies, and even international observers have repeatedly dismissed as untrue or exaggerated. To Pretoria, it was clear. The ban was built on a narrative that didn't match the country's legal reality. But the deeper problem was not the accusation, it was the precedent. If the U.S. could expel a member on its own, then the G20 was no longer a forum. It was a monarchy with a rotating king. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa responded publicly and firmly. He said the U.S. move was a direct contradiction of G20 values and a violation of every protocol the group has ever followed. Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola went further, calling the ban unlawful and structurally impossible. His point was simple. The G20 does not belong to the host. It belongs to all its members. Behind the scenes, Pretoria's diplomats scrambled to understand what had pushed Washington to such an extreme. They reviewed the timeline of recent events, analyzing how relations had deteriorated. Something wasn't adding up. The U.S. had not behaved like a country reacting to a fresh crisis. It had behaved like a country executing a plan already in motion. And that led to a difficult but necessary question inside the South African government. Was the U.S. ban really triggered by the allegations themselves, or had something happened earlier that set this whole confrontation in motion? Yes, something had happened earlier. And it wasn't a small misunderstanding or a routine diplomatic disagreement. It was a public humiliation that unfolded quietly during South Africa's G20 presidency in Johannesburg, long before Trump announced the ban. That incident became the seed of the crisis, the moment the relationship between Pretoria and Washington began to visibly fracture. It started when South Africa hosted its G20 summit, an event meant to showcase its leadership, its diplomacy, and its vision for a more inclusive global economy. Dozens of countries attended with full delegations. Heads of state delivered speeches praising South Africa's Ubuntu-inspired theme. The IMF, India, Germany, Brazil, Indonesia, and others applauded the summit's openness. The United States, however, made a choice that stunned the entire diplomatic corps. It boycotted the summit. Washington did not send a cabinet-level envoy, a senior diplomat, or even a well-known official. It stayed away entirely, claiming it was protesting violence against white farmers and racial discrimination, allegations South Africa's courts had already dismissed as baseless. But Pretoria understood that this boycott wasn't about facts. It was a signal, a warning, a message that the US no longer viewed South Africa as a partner worth engaging on equal terms. But the real insult, the one that turned irritation into full-blown confrontation, came during the ceremonial handover of the G20 presidency symbols. This ritual is sacred in diplomacy. It must be done between equals. A foreign minister to a foreign minister, or a head of state to a head of state. It represents continuity, respect, and shared global responsibility. The US sent a low-ranking embassy official, not an ambassador, not a minister, not even a senior counselor. Just a junior representative, someone far below the protocol standards for such an event. Pretoria refused immediately. To hand over the G20 insignia to a junior official would signal that South Africa accepted the US's diminished treatment of it. It would also legitimize Washington's disrespect in front of the entire world. What followed was rapid and aggressive. Within days, Trump froze US aid to South Africa. Subsidies tied to American programs were halted. Secretary of State Marco Rubio published a sharp essay accusing South Africa's policies of reverse discrimination. Conservative US media began echoing the narrative that South Africa was targeting white farmers, despite the lack of legal evidence. In Pretoria, diplomats realized the boycott had never been about farmers or land. The United States had already decided to pick a fight. The G20 summit simply became the stage on which Washington tried to shrink South Africa's diplomatic status. The ban announced later wasn't sudden. It was the next escalation. But even as South Africa braced itself, it prepared something Washington didn't expect, a response that would challenge the legality of the US decision itself. And that leads to the next question. How did South Africa strike back in a way that instantly shifted the balance of this diplomatic war? South Africa's counterstrike didn't come in the form of a speech or a press conference. It arrived as something far more devastating, a legal, diplomatic, and procedural dismantling of the US position, delivered in a sharply written letter from Foreign Minister Ronald Lamola to US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Lamola's letter was not emotional. It did not defend South Africa against accusations or try to win sympathy. Instead, it attacked the foundation of the US decision. It exposed what Washington had ignored, misunderstood, or chosen to violate. The letter's first point was the most explosive. The United States has no authority, zero, to exclude a G20 member. Lamola reminded Rubio that the G20 does not operate like a private club, where the host chooses who attends. Membership cannot be suspended, removed, or downgraded by any single country. Only a collective decision by all members could alter South Africa's status, and such a process has never even been contemplated in the group's history. With one paragraph, Lamola turned the US ban from a decision into an illegal act, something that had no procedural standing, no legitimacy, and no binding force. The US could announce exclusion, but the G20 framework itself would simply ignore it. His second point went directly after the accusations Washington had been using as justification. Lamola stated unequivocally that South Africa's land reform, equity policies, and redress programs were constitutional requirements, designed to correct the structural imbalances left by apartheid. They were not policies invented by a ruling party, not ideological experiments, and not tools of discrimination. They were part of a national healing mandate embedded in the country's democracy. In other words, these policies were not up for negotiation, especially not by a foreign country. The third point in Lamola's letter reframed the entire crisis. South Africa was not the unstable, declining state portrayed in Trump's messaging. Lamola presented economic data demonstrating GDP growth has more than doubled since 1994, an expanding agricultural export sector, rising human development indicators, functioning democratic institutions with international respect. This was not a country collapsing. This was a country being misrepresented for political purposes. At this point, Washington expected South Africa to play defense. Instead, Pretoria attacked the U.S. narrative and exposed the ban as both procedurally invalid and factually unsupported. Diplomats in Europe, Asia, and South America began questioning the legality of the U.S. action. Some even suggested that the U.S. itself was violating the very norms it demanded others follow. But Lamola didn't stop there. He also highlighted the success of South Africa's G20 presidency, called the People's G20, which had been praised by India, the IMF, Germany, and other delegations for its inclusive, Ubuntu-driven approach. Suddenly, the question was no longer, what is wrong with South Africa, but why is the United States isolating itself from the global consensus? Pretoria had shifted the battlefield, but this raises the next turning point. If South Africa had dismantled the U.S. argument so thoroughly, why did Washington continue pushing a narrative that clearly didn't match economic or political reality? Let's pause for a second to say big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Washington continued pushing a narrative that didn't match reality because, for the United States under Trump, this confrontation had never been about facts. It had never been about South Africa's economy, its agriculture, its institutions, or its treatment of anyone. It was about something far more powerful in American politics, a story that sells. Inside the U.S., the idea of white farmers under attack in Africa had become a potent political symbol, one that resonated deeply with Trump's voter base. It echoed older fears, older myths, older racial anxieties. It generated headlines, mobilized supporters, and reinforced Trump's image as someone who protects persecuted groups abroad, even when the persecution itself lacked credible evidence. In that context, South Africa wasn't a country anymore. It was a stage. And the story being told on that stage didn't need to be accurate, it only needed to be effective. Yet Pretoria refused to play along. When Lamola and Ramaphosa presented economic data and institutional evidence, they weren't simply correcting the record. They were dismantling a political weapon Washington had already committed to using. Trump's narrative depended on portraying South Africa as a collapsing, unstable nation consumed by racial conflict. But the numbers told a different story entirely. Unemployment challenges, yes, but stable governance. Persistent inequality, yes, but steady human development growth. A painful past, yes, but functioning law, courts, and constitutional protections. A complex land issue, yes, but no organized campaign of racial violence. Pretoria's refusal to validate the U.S. narrative put Washington in a difficult place. If the U.S. backed down, it would admit that its entire justification for the G20 ban was politically inflated. If it continued pushing, it risked being seen as undermining global institutions over a domestic storyline. Washington chose the second path. Rubio's Substack essay shifted tone from outrage to ideology, framing South Africa's equity policies as reverse discrimination. Conservative news outlets amplified it. Commentators who had never set foot in South Africa suddenly spoke like experts on the country's internal dynamics. And the U.S. boycott of South Africa's G20 summit began looking less like a protest and more like a campaign where the truth mattered far less than the narrative. Meanwhile, Pretoria doubled down on facts. It reminded the world that its agriculture sector was thriving, not collapsing. It highlighted rising exports and new partnerships. It emphasized the legitimacy of its constitutional reforms. South Africa wasn't simply defending itself. It was revealing that Washington's accusations were inconsistent, unverified, and politically convenient. And this public mismatch between the US narrative and South African reality created a new problem. If the world saw the US twisting facts for political purposes, what did that mean for the credibility of the G20 under US leadership? Countries began asking themselves a dangerous question quietly. If a host country can weaponize lies to exclude a member, what stops future hosts from doing the same? And what does that mean for the survival of the G20 itself? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. If a host country could weaponize a narrative to exclude a member, then the G20 was facing a crisis it was never designed to survive. The group was built on one fragile assumption: that every member, no matter how powerful, would respect the rules. There was no enforcement mechanism, no disciplinary clause, no penalty system, because the founders believed no member would ever try what the United States had just attempted. But Washington broke the assumption. And suddenly, the G20's greatest strength, its reliance on trust, became its greatest weakness. Countries began quietly holding internal consultations. If the US could exclude South Africa today, what would stop another host from excluding India over Kashmir, or Turkey over domestic politics, or Brazil over the Amazon, or Indonesia over palm oil regulations? The rule was simple. Once a precedent is set, it becomes a tool in the hands of every future leader. Pretoria understood this immediately. South Africa's resistance was not only about restoring its seat, but also preventing the G20 from evolving into a forum controlled by the whims of the host. If members allowed one exclusion, the G20 would transform from a group of 20 into a group of whoever the host approves. That would destroy the entire institution. This was why South Africa refused to accept the ban quietly. It wasn't defiance for pride's sake. It was a defense of multilateralism, the idea that global rules matter more than the most powerful country's mood. And suddenly other nations saw Pretoria not as a troublemaker, but as a shield. In London, policymakers began warning privately that the G20 could fracture if the issue wasn't resolved. In Brussels, EU diplomats acknowledged the danger of allowing hosts to interpret rules unilaterally. Even countries aligned with the US understood the risk. Today's target was South Africa, but tomorrow it could be them. The United Kingdom emerged as a potential mediator, not out of charity but out of necessity. If the US-South Africa standoff continued, the 2026 G20 could become the first summit in history where major members boycotted the host. That would be the beginning of the end, because a G20 where giants refuse to show up is a G20 that ceases to function. Meanwhile, South Africa leaned into its role as a defender of the global South. It reminded members that the G20 was originally expanded to give emerging economies a voice. Voices that could not be silenced simply because a powerful nation disliked their internal policies. Pretoria framed this moment not as a bilateral dispute, but as a crossroads for all developing countries. Would they allow the US to turn the G20 into a tool of political pressure? Or would they stand with South Africa to preserve equality within the group? And that leads to the final unavoidable question, one that will define the next era of US-South Africa relations and perhaps the G20 itself. What happens when a rising global South refuses to bow and the United States refuses to back down? You get exactly what the world is witnessing now. A diplomatic confrontation that is no longer about an invitation or a protocol breach, but about who gets to shape the rules of global power in the 21st century. In Washington, the US doubled down. Aid remained frozen. Trade dialogues were paused. Rubio sharpened his rhetoric. Conservative media intensified its portrayal of South Africa as a failed state. The White House signaled that reinstating South Africa into the 2026 G20 cycle was not under consideration. The message was simple: America would not reverse itself, even in the face of international criticism. But Pretoria did not flinch. Ramaphosa held the line. Lamola remained unshaken. South Africa refused to modify its domestic policies, refused to accept the legitimacy of the ban, and refused to apologize for constitutional reforms designed to repair the country's apartheid legacy. Pretoria was not negotiating. It was defending a principle bigger than itself. And that is when something remarkable happened. Countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America began signaling quiet support for South Africa. They recognized the pattern. They recognized the danger. Today it was South Africa being punished for its internal policies. Tomorrow it could be them for their own sovereign decisions. The global South, long fragmented by geography and political differences, finally found a moment where unity made sense. South Africa was not just fighting for itself, it was fighting for the dignity of every emerging nation told to comply or be sidelined. This shift rattled Washington. Not publicly, not loudly, but internally. Because the U.S. depends on the G20 to project leadership on global finance, trade, climate, and technology. A summit where major Southern economies boycott or resist the host could severely undermine America's influence. It could push countries closer to China, India, Russia, or alternative forums like BRICS+, where Western dominance is already diluted. South Africa understood that leverage. Quietly, without chest-thumping, Pretoria made it clear that it had no intention of attending the 2026 G20 as an inferior guest. It would either attend as a full, equal founding member, or it would not attend at all. And if it refused, several developing countries hinted they might reconsider their participation too. This possibility alarmed European capitals. A fractured G20 in 2026 would signal the symbolic end of Western-led multilateralism. It would also expose a new truth. The global South is no longer willing to let its economic future be dictated by a single power, no matter how strong. That is why the United Kingdom stepped forward, quietly preparing a mediation channel. Not to fix South Africa, but to prevent the G20 from tearing itself apart under US rigidity. Britain, still connected to both worlds, understood what was at stake. If the 2026 summit collapses, the G20 as we know it may not survive. Yet even with mediation on the horizon, the question remains unresolved, hanging over Washington and Pretoria like a shadow neither can escape. If South Africa refuses to bend and the United States refuses to retreat, who will make the next move, and how far will this showdown go? Let us know in the comment section. Will the world stand with South Africa? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.